Sometimes you pick up these really complex texts, maybe scholarly work on, say, ancient religious writings, and they just feel heavy, almost
Yeah.
impenetrable,
Oh,
really.
absolutely. Like you need a special decoder ring or something.
Exactly. How do you even start to make sense of that kind of dense material without just, getting completely lost in the weeds?
It's a real challenge. I mean, these are texts from very different worlds, different mindsets, and the language itself can be tricky, used in specific ways.
Hmm.
You definitely need a way in, some tools to help you decode not just the words, but the whole picture behind them.
And that's pretty much exactly what we're doing today, right? We're diving in, using these sources you've brought to tackle Paul's letters in the New Testament, the language, the theology.
And crucially, the historical context.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're looking at it through those lenses: linguistic analysis, theology, history.
So our mission today for this deep dive is basically to unpack the big insights from this material we've got.
Exactly. We want to pull out maybe some surprising facts, clear up some of the really complex ideas, and just see what these sources tell us about Paul's message, how it was built, how it landed, how people actually understood it back then.
I have to say, I'm really looking forward to this. Paul's just such a huge figure, and getting to grips with his thought, especially with this kind of guidance from the sources, feels like a good way to maybe cut through some of the confusion.
And the material we have is great because it gives us different angles. We can look right down at the language level, the words, the structure. Then there's the theology itself, the big ideas about God and humanity. And we have to put it all in that first century context. It's all connected.
Okay, let's start there then with how we even read these things. One of the articles jumps right into analyzing texts on different linguistic levels: grammatical, stylistic, discourse, pragmatic. Sounds a bit technical.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for reading Paul?
Think of it like looking at a building. Grammar is the basic structure, the foundation, making sure it stands up, sentences that work. Style is like the choice of materials, brick or wood. Why this word, not another? It affects the feel, the tone.
Okay, structure and word choice. Got it.
Right. Then discourse is the layout, how the rooms connect, the overall plan, how are ideas linked, how are arguments built. Maybe you see a problem presented, then a solution offered. That's discourse structure.
Makes sense.
And pragmatics. That's about the purpose. What's the building for? Who's it meant for? How should it affect people? In a text, it's about the author's goal, the impact they want to have on the reader.
Okay, that analogy really helps. So it's not just reading the words, it's understanding the blueprint, the materials, the whole design, and its intended effect.
Precisely. And the sources make a really key point here. New Testament letters, while religious, are absolutely packed with ideology, not just abstract beliefs, but a whole set of ideas and values meant to be lived out, especially in how people relate within their groups, their communities.
Because what you believe shapes how you act, how you interact with others.
Exactly. And the reading shows how this ideology is baked right into the language itself. It's in the specific words Paul picks, sometimes even new words he coins, neologisms. It's even in how he organizes his arguments, like that problem-solution format. These aren't just random choices. They reinforce the message, the worldview he's presenting.
So why start here? Why is understanding these linguistic mechanics useful for, someone just trying to understand Paul?
Because it helps you become a more active reader, I think. When you understand how the message is constructed, the word choices, the structure, the aims you see, not just what's being said, but how Paul is trying to shape your understanding, what viewpoint he's urging you towards. It's like seeing the builder's tools, not just the finished house. Makes you much more aware.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so with that sort of framework in mind, let's turn to Paul himself. The sources really hammer home his significance, don't they?
They absolutely do. I mean, he's presented as having this colossal impact on how Christianity developed. One source even says he laid a theological foundation that's, quote, never been rivaled or superseded.
Wow.
Yeah, and he gets called the second founder of Christianity. That tells you something about the perceived scale of his influence, maybe even suggesting it was stronger in shaping the future church than Peter or James.
That's putting him on a massive pedestal.
It is. But, and this is crucial, the sources are also incredibly clear. You just can't grasp Paul's theology in a bubble. It wasn't thought up in an ivory tower. It was deeply, deeply embedded in the real-world social dynamics of the first century Mediterranean.
So his writing was a direct response to what people were actually living through.
Totally. The sources highlight things like the power of patrons, wealthy benefactors, social networks and status, who was important, who wasn't, the nature of slavery back then. Even things like food, how sharing a meal communicated social bonds, rituals defining who was in and who was out. These weren't abstract theological points. They were messy, real-life social challenges these early Christian groups were facing.
And presumably, he's writing to people who already share some basic assumptions.
Yes, often his speech about God, as one source puts it, relies on things his audience would just take for granted, like the importance of the will of God. That concept already had weight in their world.
So, the big takeaway here, it seems, is that if you really want to understand Paul, you can't just read his letters as timeless theological treatises. You have to see them as, like, dynamic conversations responding to concrete problems people were facing. It makes it feel much more grounded.
Exactly. It's theology forged in the midst of life, not separate from it.
Right. Okay, let's dive into some of the key concepts then. The sources spend some time unpacking Paul's ideas. One big one is flesh sarx. That seems to be a really loaded term for him.
It really is, and the readings help clarify it. Sarx for Paul covers a spectrum. Sometimes it's just human weakness, frailty, but it's also this whole way of living that's caught up in decaying materiality, a way of being that one source says, thinking of Romans 8, is headed inescapably for death.
So it's not literally just the physical body.
No, and that's a critical distinction the sources make. They're quite clear. It's not some kind of cosmic evil force, like in some other systems. It's more like, referencing Romans 7, sin sets up its headquarters in the flesh. It uses our physical existence, our desires, as its base of operations. It's described as a sphere or character of existence.
That's a really important nuance. It's a condition, a way of being, not just tissue. What about soul versus spirit, psyche and pneuma?
Yeah, the sources draw a contrast. You've got the classical Greek idea of psyche, often seen as immortal, separable from the body. Then there's the Hebrew idea, nephesh, which is more like the whole living person, the life force. And it's interesting, Paul actually uses psyche pretty rarely. One source says only about 13 times.
Okay, so he's not really working with that Greek philosophical model of the soul.
Doesn't seem like it. His real focus, according to the material, is much more on pneuma, the spirit, specifically the spirit of life. And the key link the sources highlight is that Christ is experienced through the Spirit. Thinking of 1 Corinthians 6, the believer and the Lord become one spirit. The Spirit is the bridge, the medium.
The spirit is how that connection happens. Okay, moving on, what about sin and the fall? How does Paul see that originating?
Well, the reading notes he traces human sinfulness back to a specific primeval act of disobedience, Adam and Eve, and the punishment that followed. This is contrasted with someone like Ben Sira, who also talks about human sinfulness, but doesn't necessarily tie it all back to that one single original event, in quite the same way Paul does.
So for Paul, that origin story is fundamental to understanding why things are the way they are. The sources also touch on sexual ethics.
Yes, they link misused sexual desire, epithemia, with concepts like uncleanness, akatharsia, and passion, pathos. This covers porneia, which is often translated as sexual immorality or unlawful sexual intercourse. And Paul's command in 1 Corinthians 6 is pretty stark. Flee porneia.
And the sources mention there's some debate among scholars about why Paul gives certain instructions, say in 1 Corinthians 7.
They do. One reading mentions discussion around whether his advice there comes from, say, reacting against some kind of extreme asceticism in Corinth, or maybe from a place of wanting believers to have a sort of spiritual detachment from worldly concerns. The material presents this neutrally, just noting that scholars are still hashing out the exact motivations.
Right, it's a reminder that interpretation is ongoing. Now, maybe one of the most radical ideas in Paul, according to these sources, is grace charis.
Oh, this is fascinating. The sources really stress how Paul's idea of grace blows typical Greco-Roman ideas out of the water. The whole system of benefaction where you give a gift expecting something back, maybe loyalty or a return favor.
Yeah, reciprocity.
Exactly. And it's even distinct from the Old Testament idea of cheesed, which is more like covenant faithfulness. Paul's grace is just different.
How so? What makes it so radical?
The language he uses, the sources point this out, words like it overflows, perisud, it abound, pleonazo, surpassing, hyperbolo. He talks about the riches platos of grace. The absolute core, according to the material, is that there's just no room left for any thought that the human recipient can somehow repay it. The only possible response is gratitude, thanksgiving, Eucharistia, never a return favor.
Wow, that completely reframes the whole divine-human relationship. It's a gift that demands a response, but the response is thanks, not repayment.
Exactly. It's a one-way street in terms of earning it.
So when you look at these key terms, flesh, spirit, sin, grace, why is getting these nuances right so important for someone reading Paul today?
Because they're the absolute bedrock of his thinking. If you misunderstand flesh, you miss his whole take on the human struggle. If you blur psyche and pneuma, you miss how he understands our connection to Christ. And if you water down that radical, unrepayable grace, you kind of miss the heart of his gospel message about salvation. Getting these specific meanings right just fundamentally changes how you read him.
That leads us perfectly into the next big area. Law, justification, how we get right with God, and identity in Paul's thought. The sources talk about his pretty sharp critique of Israel and the law.
Yeah, especially in Romans 2 and 3 and Galatians 3 and 4. The critique, as presented, isn't that the law itself is bad, but it's aimed at what Paul saw as Israel's tendency to assume this automatic favored nation status and to boast in the law. They saw keeping the law as the badge of their special relationship with God. Paul viewed this as focusing too much on the outward and visible, defining who's in based on external things, or as he puts it, in the flesh.
And the phrase works of the law comes into play here.
It does. Now, traditionally, that's often understood as trying to earn salvation through good deeds, but the material adds another layer. Works of the law were also seen as a peculiarly Jewish problem, because these practices, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath keeping specifically marked Jews as distinct from Gentiles, even believing Gentiles. Romans 9 seems to illustrate this. So it was also about identity markers, social boundaries.
So it's tied up with who belongs and how you prove it, based on specific law practices. Which leads right to Paul's counterproposal, justification by faith alone.
Yes, exactly. This is presented as the absolute core contrast, the game changer in Paul's message. The sources point to Galatians 2.16. You're justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law shall no flesh be justified. That idea gets worked out intensely in Galatians 3 and Romans 3 and 4.
And the big result of being justified by faith, especially thinking about that Jew-Gentile divide.
Radical inclusion. If acceptance by God is based purely on faith, then Gentiles can fully experience the blessing promised to Abraham. They get to share in Israel's inheritance, as Romans 4 and Galatians 3 put it. The old boundaries based on law observance are gone, replaced by a new shared identity in Christ through faith.
That's a massive theological and social shift. What about those tricky phrases in Romans like law of faith or law of the Spirit? They sound almost contradictory if faith replaces law.
They can sound that way, yeah. But the scholarly view presented in the sources suggests Paul is using nomos law in these specific cases more broadly, like rule or principle or system. So you can contrast the principle of faith or the principle of the spirit of life with the old principle of sin and death. And crucially, he argues in Romans 3 that this new principle of faith actually upholds the true intention of the Torah.
So it's not faith versus law, but faith as the true fulfillment or operating principle that the law pointed towards.
It seems to be the idea presented. It's about contrasting two ways of operating, one rooted in human effort under the law that leads to failure, the other rooted in faith empowered by the Spirit that leads to life. And this new way actually achieves what the law intended.
You can really see Paul grappling here with huge questions. How do we connect with God? What defines us? How do different people become one people? These are issues that, frankly, are still very much alive today.
Absolutely. And understanding Paul's specific take provides such a vital historical perspective on those ongoing conversations.
Okay, let's shift from the big ideas to how they actually worked out on the ground. The sources also talk about community, experience, and ethics in Paul's world. Being in Christ and having the Spirit. This wasn't just theory, was it?
No, not at all. The reading really emphasizes that being in Christ and having the Spirit were like two sides of the one coin, pointing to Romans 8 and Galatians 3. For Paul and the people in his churches, this was real. They must have sensed Christ as a living presence, something active in their lives, and especially when they gathered.
That sounds incredibly intense, almost tangible.
It does. And the sources suggest this powerful mix, their new status from justification, the sense of participation in Christ, and the divine enabling from the Spirit. This is what gave early Christianity its edge. It had intellectual appeal, embracing experience, and motivated ethic. It was a compelling package deal.
There's also an interesting observation comparing baptism and the Spirit.
Yeah, it's noted that Paul actually talks less about baptism than he does about receiving the Spirit. It seems for him and his converts, the gift of the Spirit was the really focal and most memorable feature of their conversion. Baptism was important, certainly, but that powerful experience of the Spirit's arrival was maybe the defining moment in their memory.
Huh. That's surprising. The personal spiritual experience maybe trumped the formal ritual in their minds. How did Paul think about the church community itself?
The sources discuss his use of the word ecclesia, churches of God. The suggestion is that this term deliberately echoed the Old Testament's assembly of Yahweh, implying continuity. It's significant that he never calls these groups synagogues. And apparently, using churches of God didn't require a lot of explanation for his readers, suggesting they already understood themselves in this way as the new gathering of God's people.
And what about core practices like the Lord's Supper? The sources look at 1 Corinthians 11.
Yes, and they stress that Paul saw it as a full meal, a deepanon, like the main evening meal. The bread and cup were key moments within that shared dinner. The big problem in Corinth wasn't just a wrong idea about the bread and cup, it was terrible behavior at the meal itself. People rushing ahead, eating their own food, the rich ignoring the poor, some even getting drunk. This social failure, this breakdown of community at the meal, was why they were answerable for the body and blood of the Lord. Sharing the bread and cup within that communal context was supposed to constitute, embody, express, build up the one body.
So the profound theological meaning was directly tied to the very practical social act of sharing food together properly. If they failed socially, they failed spiritually.
Precisely. The social division undermined the very meaning of being Christ's body together.
How did Paul motivate ethical behavior then?
According to the sources, the focus is heavily on mutual relationships, the horizontal level between believers. The driving force is the love command, referencing Galatians 5 and Romans 13. Loving one another is presented as fulfilling the entire law. It's the lens through which all other ethical guidance should be understood and lived out.
And finally, what about authority structures? Briefly.
Well, there's Paul's own strong assertion of his apostolic authority, based on his encounter with the risen Christ and the results of his work. Within the churches, prophetic speech wasn't just accepted carte blanche. It was supposed to be evaluated by the others, likely other prophets, as 1 Corinthians 14 suggests.
And there's that difficult bit in 1 Corinthians 14 about women.
Yes, verses 33b-36, where women are told to be silent in church meetings. The sources acknowledge this is a really challenging passage, and they note neutrally that scholars debate its meaning, authenticity, and how it fits with other things Paul says about women participating in ministry. It's flagged as a point of tension and ongoing scholarly discussion.
This whole section really does bring Paul's theology down to earth. It shows how these weren't just abstract doctrines but shaped real community life, spiritual feeling, everyday ethics. Details like the supper being a full meal or the focus on the Spirit's impact, they give you a real glimpse into that early Christian world.
Exactly. It connects the high theology to the often messy business of people trying to live together in a new way.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, the sources leave us with this idea that circles back a bit. Paul's theology itself wasn't some finished, static thing. It was a real dialogue, wasn't it? Shaped by interaction with other ideas, maybe even evolving in his own mind.
Yeah, that dynamic quality is probably a big reason why his letters are still so endlessly debated and feel so alive today.
Yeah.
They kind of draw you into the conversation he was having.
So just to recap, we've used these sources to look at the tools for reading complex texts, how language itself carries ideology, the absolute necessity of Paul's context. We've unpacked some key theological terms, flesh, spirit, grace, justification, and seen how these ideas translated into actual community life, spiritual experience, and ethics.
And doing this kind of guided exploration, drawing on what experts have analyzed, it really can give you shortcuts to understanding. It helps you spot connections and nuances you might otherwise just read right past.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with maybe one final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. Paul was constantly dealing with very real, very practical social issues in his letters, how people behaved at meals in Corinth, how Jewish and Gentile believers related to each other around the law. So the question is, how do the ways Paul connected his deepest theological beliefs to the concrete social realities of his day challenge us to think about the connection between our own core beliefs and the practical, social, messy realities of our lives and communities today?
It's a connection that never really goes away, does it? Still incredibly relevant.
Definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.